Let's talk about a queen who was never supposed to rule. A woman who inherited a kingdom on its knees, and somehow, against all odds, became one of the most iconic monarchs in history. Elizabeth I.
So you have to ask, how did she do it? How does a princess declared illegitimate by her own father end up becoming this legendary ruler? Well, we're going to dig into how she navigated a kingdom that was just teetering on the brink of collapse and managed to forge a golden age. We're going to focus on those critical first 30 years of her rule, from 1558 to 1588, because that period, it didn't just define her reign, it really defined the future of England itself.
Picture this, it's 1558. A 25-year-old Elizabeth takes the throne, but what she's inheriting is an absolute mess. The country is broke, it's torn apart by violent religious conflicts, and it's surrounded by powerful enemies just waiting for her to fail. Honestly, almost nobody thought she would last.
To really get a grip on the massive mountain Elizabeth had to climb, we first have to look at the crazy Tudor family roller coaster she was born into. You know, the decades right before Elizabeth were just a dizzying back and forth. Her grandfather, Henry VII, he literally seized the crown in battle. Then her father, the famous Henry VIII, rips the entire country away from the Catholic Church. Then her brother Edward pushes this really intense Protestantism, only for her sister Mary to come in and violently drag England right back to Catholicism. For the average person, it was just constant whiplash-inducing change.
And this tangled family tree, this says it all. It shows you the chaos right at the heart of the Tudor dynasty. Just look at Henry VIII and his 6 wives. This was so much more than just royal drama. Every single marriage meant a huge political and religious earthquake for the whole country. And of course, it directly threw the legitimacy of his own children, including Elizabeth, into question.
And here we get to the absolute core of her problem. After Henry VIII had her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed, he declared his own daughter, Elizabeth, illegitimate. This wasn't just some family insult, it was a legal weapon. It cast this shadow over her entire life and gave her enemies the perfect excuse to argue that she was never, ever the rightful queen.
Okay, so let's break down the specific threats that were waiting for Elizabeth the moment she put on that crown in 1558.
She was facing what was basically a perfect storm of problems. The country was split right down the middle between Protestants and Catholics who hated each other. Her own right to be queen was constantly being attacked. And because she was an unmarried woman, her own advisors saw her as weak and were constantly pressuring her to get married so a man could rule for her. And to top it all off, the huge Catholic superpowers of Europe, France and Spain, they looked at her as a heretic who needed to be removed.
And, these weren't just abstract problems on a list. She was surrounded by very real, very powerful people who actively wanted to take her crown. First, there was the ghost of her half-sister Mary I. Her marriage to the King of Spain had been a disaster, and her brutal persecution of Protestants had earned her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. Elizabeth inherited a nation that was deeply scarred by all that bitterness and division.
And then you have her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, to a huge number of Catholics in England and across Europe, Mary was the true Queen of England. She had a very strong claim to the throne, and this wasn't just some fringe idea. It was actively supported by the Pope himself, who saw Elizabeth as an illegitimate heretic. Mary became the magnet for pretty much every single plot against Elizabeth for decades.
And finally, looming over absolutely everything, was Philip II of Spain. This guy was the most powerful man in the world, a die-hard Catholic, and, get this, he had actually been King of England when he was married to Elizabeth's sister Mary. He saw Protestant England not just as a political threat, but as a personal insult. This set the stage for one of history's greatest rivalries.
So faced with all these enemies, both at home and abroad, what does she do? Well, Elizabeth responded not with brute force, but with brilliant political strategy and just incredible patience. She played the long game. Her very first move was a political masterstroke. It was called the Religious Settlement of 1559, and it created this pragmatic middle way. Basically, it established a Protestant church, which made the reformers happy, but it kept some of the familiar ceremonies and decorations from the Catholic service. The genius of it wasn't to make everyone happy. That was impossible. The point was to make sure as few people as possible were angry enough to actually start a civil war.
But of course, compromise didn't stop her most determined enemies. For the next 20 years, her spymaster, Francis Walsingham, uncovered plot after plot to assassinate her and put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. But with every plot she survived, she just got stronger, and her government got better at hunting down its enemies.
So, after years of this Cold War, with proxy conflicts and even state-sponsored piracy, the simmering conflict with Philip II's Catholic Spain finally just boiled over into open war.
The year is 1588. This is it. This is the ultimate test of her rule, the defining moment of her entire reign. Everything she had spent the last 30 years building was now completely on the line.
Philip II sent the mighty Spanish Armada, the largest naval fleet Europe had ever seen, to invade England, topple Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism by force. But in one of history's greatest upsets, the smaller, faster English ships, helped by a massive storm, famously defeated the supposedly invincible Armada.
While her troops waited for the invasion, Elizabeth gave one of the most famous speeches in English history, completely shattering the expectation of a weak and feeble woman. The victory that followed was more than just a battle won. It was a massive propaganda coup. It secured her throne once and for all, it cemented England's identity as a Protestant nation, and it forged her legacy as a truly formidable leader.
And yet, her greatest triumph also created a looming failure. Elizabeth famously never married. She called herself the Virgin Queen, married only to her kingdom. But by refusing to have a child and name an heir, she guaranteed that the Tudor dynasty, the very dynasty her father had fought so brutally to secure, would die with her. A final, fascinating paradox for a truly remarkable queen.